Hitler believed that war was the only way to obtain living space, or Lebensraum, meaning enough territory for the German people to expand. This living space was planned as part of a greater German Reich stretching eastward, all the way to the Ural Mountains in Russia. At the same time, this eastward expansion was not simply about occupying more territory. It also involved what became known as the General Plan Ost, secret Nazi program centered on large-scale genocide and ethnic cleansing of the populations living in those regions. But once the war actually began, the territory controlled by Nazi Germany did not perfectly match the empire originally imagined. Germany never occupied Sweden, for example, while it did take control of France and many other parts of Europe. In terms of territory, the change was dramatic. In 1925, during the Weimar Republic, Germany covered roughly 469,000 square kilometers. By 1940, under Nazi rule, that figure had expanded to around 824,000 square kilometers. And if all the territories placed under German civilian administration or military occupation during the war are included, the total area under German control approached 2.7 million square kilometers. At that size, Germany would have ranked among the 10 largest countries in the world. By comparison, modern Germany is even smaller than it was in 1925, covering around 358,000 square kilometers and ranking roughly 64th worldwide by area. So how did a country that expanded so quickly still end up losing the war? There was no single reason. Nazi Germany made a long series of strategic and economic mistakes throughout the conflict. At the beginning of the war, its economy was not fully mobilized for total war. Germany later trapped itself in a two-front conflict, and the deeper its forces advanced into the Soviet Union, the longer and more difficult its supply lines became. There were also major failures in crucial campaigns, including Stalingrad and Kursk. Most importantly, Adolf Hitler eventually chose to declare war on the United States. And when overall national strength is compared, Germany was already at a serious disadvantage against several of its main enemies. Germany's GDP was not dramatically smaller than that of the Soviet Union, but the British Empire and the United States each possessed economies more than twice Germany's size. Their demographic advantages were also significant. They had larger populations and access to far greater territories from which they could draw raw materials. There was another resource that modern warfare depended on heavily, and Germany never had enough of it. Oil. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a much stronger position in that regard. But what if those problems had turned out differently? What if Germany had avoided those mistakes? And what if Nazi Germany had actually won World War II? What kind of world would have followed? The idea of an ultimate Axis victory has been explored repeatedly in novels, films, television series, and video games over the decades. At least 35 novels, 5 films, 6 video games, and 5 television series have used some version of this scenario. One of the best-known examples is Amazon's television series *The Man in the High Castle Faye. Before imagining what the world after a Nazi victory might have looked like, however, it is necessary to examine the moments before Germany's defeat became inevitable, and ask what might have changed the outcome. The first major question is Britain. Britain is an island that made any large-scale German invasion. Germany would first have needed control of the skies, and at the same time, enough control of the sea to cross the English Channel safely. But if Germany had won the Battle of Britain, and if the Dunkirk evacuation had ended very differently, the course of the war might genuinely have changed. Under those circumstances, Germany might have attempted a direct invasion of Britain, or perhaps forced Britain into a negotiated peace. Then comes the Soviet Union. The invasion of the Soviet Union can be considered one of Adolf Hitler's greatest strategic mistakes of the entire war. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, German forces did advance extremely quickly. Huge areas of Soviet territory fell in a short period of time. The problem was that as German troops moved farther east, they were no longer fighting only the Soviet military. The enormous distances, the size of the Soviet population, and the Soviet Union's ability to produce oil increasingly worked against Germany. If Germany wanted to improve its chances, one of the most obvious changes would have been preparing proper winter clothing and enough cold weather supplies for its troops before the campaign. Germany might also have made much greater use of the populations living in the territories it occupied. Nazi ideology classified many Eastern European peoples as racially inferior. In reality, however, some of those populations were also deeply hostile to the Soviet system, including parts of the Ukrainian population. If Germany had avoided such extreme racial policies, at the same time, capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus should have been treated as one of Germany's highest strategic priorities. Whoever controlled enough oil had the ability to keep tanks, aircraft, and the entire machinery of modern warfare operating. Even if all of these mistakes had been avoided, however, the probability of a complete Nazi victory would still have remained low. Low does not mean theoretically impossible. The final result would still have depended on how each major turning point and the last enormous obstacle Germany could not ignore was the United States. Unless Nazi Germany had developed atomic weapons before the United States, there was virtually no realistic way for Germany to defeat America through conventional military means. The American economy was simply too large. Even when the Axis powers were at the height of their strength, their combined economic output still could not truly surpass that of the United States. The same problem existed with population. America had a much larger demographic base than Germany. More importantly, the United States had enough domestic oil to support its army, navy, and air force for a prolonged conflict. For that reason, Adolf Hitler's declaration of war on the United States effectively meant voluntarily adding another enormous enemy to Germany's list. From Germany's perspective, a more favorable outcome might not have been the total defeat of the United States at all. Instead, it might have been a prolonged geopolitical standoff, something resembling the Cold War that later developed between Washington and Moscow. If World War II had ended with Germany controlling most of Europe, then the most horrifying stage might only have begun after the fighting stopped. Adolf Hitler would have gained the conditions needed to implement the General Plan Ost under this program. The Nazis intended to systematically remove the populations they described as barbaric Slavs. Different ethnic groups were assigned different planned levels of destruction. Altogether, around 110 million people could have been killed. Another 15 million might have been deported to Siberia. The remaining roughly 50.4 million people would have been forcibly Germanized and used as a labor force living under conditions resembling serfdom. Those considered unsuitable for Germanization could also have been expelled. Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler estimated that within roughly 25 years, around 10 million Germans would settle and colonize these newly conquered territories. In this hypothetical world, one of the groups facing the most extreme fate would still have been Europe's Jewish population. The Nazi objective was not simply expulsion. It was the complete destruction of Jewish communities across Europe. In fact, even before the actual war ended, this policy had already produced catastrophic results in many countries. In Poland, Greece, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, and other areas, more than 80% of the local Jewish population had already been murdered. Overall, around 60% of the Jews who had lived in these countries were killed under Nazi persecution. If Nazi Germany had won the war, the remaining nearly 4 million Jews in Europe would likely have faced the same fate. When the planned destruction of Slavic populations under the General Plan Ost is added, the additional death toll resulting from a German victory could have reached roughly 114 million people. How large is that number? World War II itself is estimated to have caused around 80 million deaths. That represented roughly 3% of the world's population at the time. Around 1/3 of those killed were military personnel, while approximately 2/3 were civilians. Across the entire span of recorded history, only around 5 major diseases are believed to have killed more people than the war. If Europe had ultimately fallen under Nazi German control, another question would have emerged almost immediately after the fighting ended. Who would eventually win the new Cold War? The United States or Nazi Germany? One possible scenario is that the United States would begin funding and training resistance movements inside German-controlled territories, including guerrilla groups in Russia, allowing them to continue fighting German rule. By the 1970s, social and cultural developments that appeared in real history, including the sexual revolution, modern art, and other new cultural movements, would probably not have been allowed to exist openly in Nazi-controlled Europe. Instead, they might have survived underground, as illegal cultural movements banned by the state. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis of our timeline might have been replaced by something resembling an Iceland missile crisis. The reason is straightforward. If Iceland had fallen inside the German sphere of influence, it might have become a major location for German medium-range missiles capable of reaching parts of the United States and Canada. Every political, military, economic, and social event could produce countless different outcomes. But if one relatively plausible direction had to be chosen, the United States would probably have had the better chance of eventually winning this Cold War, followed by a European return toward freer markets and greater individual liberty. Now consider the scenario from another angle. Suppose modern Germany had somehow retained every territory it controlled during World War II, including the areas placed under military or civilian occupation when German power reached its maximum extent. How different would the country start with territory? As mentioned earlier, modern Germany currently ranks around 64th in the world by area. With all of those territories included, it would jump directly to around 10th place. The change in population ranking would be slightly less dramatic, but still enormous. Modern Germany has roughly 83 million people and ranks around 17th worldwide. Under this hypothetical map, it would become the 4th most populous country on Earth, behind only China, India, and the United States. Its 5 largest metropolitan areas would be Paris, Berlin, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, and Katowice. 3 of those cities are located inside modern Germany. The economic change would be equally striking. Under this calculation, Germany's total GDP could rise to roughly $9 trillion, easily surpassing Japan, and potentially putting significant pressure on China from behind. Germany's current GDP per person is around $48,200. Under the expanded territorial scenario, that figure could instead fall to roughly $33,400. The main reason is that lower-income areas such as Ukraine and Belarus would reduce the country's overall average. The religious structure would also change noticeably. Christianity would remain the largest religion, representing around 73% of the total population. About 14% would be Protestant, roughly 40% Catholic, around 15% Eastern Orthodox, and another 4%, while other religions would represent around 1%. Atheists and agnostics together would make up approximately 21%. Militarily, this hypothetical Germany would also move sharply upward in global rankings, and clearly ahead of Saudi Arabia. Even so, the defense budget would represent only around 1.5% of GDP, still one of the lowest shares among the G7 countries. In terms of active duty personnel, placing it very close to Russia. If reserve forces were included as well, the ranking could drop by 1 position.